All right, so we're going to start out. The way the presentation is organized is kind of the flow of the tracks that the NP had in the Lowell and Everett area. So we're going to start in the far southeast corner in Lowell as the NP arrived on joint tracks with the Great Northern and the Milwaukee Road. By the time we're talking here, the mid-1950s, there was only one set of rails coming over from Snohomish in the Monroe area. So on these maps, red tracks are Northern Pacific, orange tracks are Milwaukee Road, and blue tracks are Great Northern. So north is to the left here. We're down in the Lowell area. And we're going to take a look at some of the industries and the tracks that the NP used to serve those industries down in the Lowell area. And then we're going to move uptown and then move over to where the depot is and that sort of thing. So we're going to do it chunk by chunk. Hopefully, you'll be able to kind of understand as I'm talking about these things where a lot of this stuff is. Easily, probably 60 to 70% of the things I'm going to show you today are completely erased. There is no physical evidence of a lot of these buildings or complexes anymore. Some of it was because they were nasty, dirty, contaminated sites, and they've all been cleaned up. I don't know with Superfund money or what, and then some of it has just been redevelopment work on smaller commercial buildings. But I will attempt to remember to tell you when there is a building that still exists, so you can go look at it today if you like. But pretty much all of the large complexes along the river are completely gone. No sign at all anymore. All right, so here we go. So I'm just showing you this map to kind of orient you. I'm going to show a couple things, and then we're going to switch over to the slides. So here's the NP coming in parallel to the GN. Right off the map is where the two separated. And then you have it serving Simpson Paper Company. You'll notice multiple colors at some of these businesses, and that's because businesses often wanted more than one railroad serving them because it helped keep rates low. So you have the NP with lots of tracks in here. And then the dotted black stuff means that the business itself owned the tracks. So a lot of the tracks in Simpson were actually owned by Simpson. Here's where the Northern Pacific originally crossed the river when it had its own separate track coming from Snohomish, which there's a whole history about that we're not going to get in today because the NP didn't build that line originally. They took it over. And then the same thing with the Milwaukee. And there's a real interesting set of bridges and tracks on trestles and everything. But that's all gone by the time we're talking the mid-1950s here. And then you have the NP also serving Washington Plywood Company. And then in my previous talk, I was talking about basically all of the railroads in Everett. We are not talking about the GN or the Milwaukee today really at all. So as a result, we're not going to see any pictures of Sumner Iron Works that the Milwaukee and the GN served up here. That's the one large industrial complex in all this that's still there, still doing business. I-5's right here, so you have to look quickly if you're driving by on I-5 to see it. It almost cuts it off. And then this large complex of tracks for the Milwaukee Road and this big yard in here and the Walton Lumber Company, that's all gone. In fact, they're starting to build houses out there, I think, aren't they? There's some road work in there now off 41st Street, I think, which is basically right here probably down into this area. And then you'll start to see the Northern Pacific Depot in Lowell, which is long, long gone, but there'll be some photos of that. That was right here. And then you have the tracks separate. You have what was called the High Line head uphill, up parallel to Broadway and terminating at about Everett Avenue where the freight house was. We're going to look at that later. And then the main NP track through the rest of Everett stayed along the river and went up this way, and we'll see what that is. And this is a connecting track here. So if you were coming south down from the depot area, you could head up to the High Line like this. Okay, does that all make sense? So we are looking north upriver at this point. This is where the river curves to the east to head off to Snohomish. And this is the big Simpson Paper factory. So it was established, I believe it's hard to see because it's pretty dark in here, but this, I believe, was established in 1892 as Puget Sound Pulp and Paper. And about 3 years later, it changed to Everett Pulp and Paper, which many of you probably know it as that business. And then Simpson, December 1st, 51, Simpson Paper purchased Everett Pulp and Paper, and the name gradually changed. I think the name on the smokestack stayed Everett Pulp and Paper for a long, long time because it was probably a lot of money to go change the lettering on that tall smokestack. And then it eventually became Simpson Lee, I think in 1959 when Lee and Simpson companies merged. But it was quite a big business. And if you ever talk to anybody who has roots in Lowell, they are still very, very proud of this business. It really defined the community for many, many years. But if we zoom in here a little bit, we can see a little more. So you've got the tracks coming in here, the GN tracks and the NP tracks start to separate as you go up. And we're going to look at it from the reverse angle here in a minute, but the NP's tracks were all pretty much over here, whereas the Great Northern served it here on this side. And you can see here, this is the Walton Lumber Company, which I've had the most trouble finding out about it of all the big industries along the river, and that's mainly because it was the first one to go away. It closed in 1962, and most of the family members are no longer with us. We do have one couple of cousins that are still here who've been extremely helpful. And then here in between is Washington Plywood, which was named that by this time. It was part of Walton before, but then Walton sold it to a company, and then they ended up selling it back to the employees, and et cetera. And there's a fairly good history of this business out on the internet. And then you can see the NP tracks here branching off, going up river. This is Eclipse Mill and other things we're going to look at later. And then another piece of the NP goes up here uphill towards Broadway, as when you get the GN main tracks here, and then they curve away. So we're going to look at all this from different angles, never fear. All right, so now we're kind of looking at the reverse angle. We were standing down here somewhere before, now we're looking back. Let's move ahead. So quite a few tracks here. There's a covered area. There's some chlorine cars that would be parked in here. And then there was a ramp that they could push cars up into with chips and things like that, because they were obviously making paper. And then you've got other things here. It looks like we've got some chip cars parked out here. These open top cars are almost certainly chip cars. And then right in here, one of these tracks right here, that's where the NP went across the river originally. They're just using it as a spur at this point. Here's another one kind of taken over from the riverside, still looking north. This is one of my favorite shots. I think it does a nice job of kind of showing you the NP tracks here. So you've got this covered area. You've got the tracks going into the plant. Some more things here. Looks like chip unloading going on here in this building, and the conveyors. A lot of these plants had lots of conveyors. They would get the material inside, and then they would move it by conveyor or air pressure around. And you can see a lot of houses in here. Okay, so let's go ahead. And then this is a street level photo. I love this. Shows the parking lot. Nice collection of cars there. Yeah, isn't that nice? Yeah. This to me kind of defines America in this era, and I'm only 49, but I'm still sad that the kind of jobs we used to have where people could afford cars like this, they weren't ostentatious, they were just good, cars. It's not becoming, it's a little more rare today. Quite a collection of stuff. All right, so, and here's just some detailed shots. This is one of the, an outside photo here that we don't know the source for this. This came from the Snohomish County Museum. This is inside. This is much earlier. This is from Julene in April of 1928, but the area inside was similar to this throughout most of the time. They, of course, mechanized more and more as time went on, but here they're working with actual paper after it's been manufactured. This is just one quick shot, again, from 1928 or 27 or so, but it's just to show you looking north. This was the second NP depot in Lowell, I believe, Dan, yes?
First.
Oh, this is the first one. This is the one that burned?
That's the Everett Monte Cristo depot.
Okay, so this is early on. This is built by the Everett and Monte Cristo before the NP took them over. We're looking north here, but this is the Milwaukee coming in here, I believe, right? They were elevated, crossing over until they started using the Great Northern Track, and then they were all part of the same thing. But that's just to give you a glimpse of that building, because the later photos are of a much different building. So this is the side of it. North is to the left here.
What was that used for?
This is the depot for the Northern Pacific in Lowell. And they all, well, at this point, the Great Northern and the NP, I think, used this depot in the Milwaukee. Did they stop on the trestle and walk down here? I don't know that they did. But later on, the Lowell depot gave orders to all three railroads as needed. This is what's known as a train order signal here. And this could be displayed so it was out perpendicular to the track and was painted red, and that let crews know they needed to stop. and at night it would have a red lens, and if there were no orders, they would be turned parallel to the track. And here's the much smaller Lowell Depot later. This is during a flood, obviously. And this is a different style train order. This is what's known as the Ames brand that the NP used many places. This was put in by the Everett and Monte Cristo, I assume, and so that was this was made by the Swift company, but the NP came through later and standardized on this stuff. And then this depot, I don't remember if I have this photo in here today or not, but it was shipped to Black River, which was right next to the original, what's the old horse track? Long Acres. That's where that station was, because the original station down there, or second station down there, was hit by a log. It fell off a train, I think, and demolished it. And so when they didn't need this anymore, they moved it down to Black River in about 1959. Yeah, here it is. Here's it on the flat car going to Black River. Bye-bye. 1960. I guess it was decommissioned in 59 and sat there for a few months, and then they shipped it out in September of 1960. You'll see a lot of these really, how in the heck did anybody ever get this photos in this presentation? A lot of them were taken by a guy named George Simonson. Did any of you know George? Yeah, George was a wonderful human being. I never got to meet him. But he was a Northern Pacific employee, worked most of his career in Everett, and just loved railroads, like Jack does, like Bob Harriman does. And when you talk to railroaders, you find out it's a fairly small percentage of railroaders who actually thought their job was more than a job. So it's really unusual and special when you have a railroader who also had a camera, who bothered to take pictures as they were working. And that's where a lot of these just, how did they get that photo, came directly from George, because he was working that day probably and had his camera with him. And his daughter, Casey, is in the midst of donating George's entire collection to the Northern Pacific, Great Northern, Milwaukee, and Spokane, Portland, and Seattle historical societies. And we're going through all that material right now. So far, we've gone through about 170 boxes of stuff. And there's a couple of more truckloads coming. So it's a very big collection. And that material will go to the four historical societies that own and operate the building in Burien. Yeah, it'll all be available over time for people to look at. So this is now, this is the edge of Simpson, and here is the Walton, Plywood, which in a couple of years became Washington Plywood. It didn't really look any different, it just changed hands. And then here you've got Walton Lumber, and then the Milwaukee tracks coming in here like this, which again, we're not talking about this today because it was served exclusively by the Milwaukee, but there aren't a lot of good photos of Washington Plywood either. So I'll just show you. It's basically a long, narrow building, and the NP's tracks came in here on the side, and that's how they served it. Okay, so let's go ahead. That's all for Lowell. I wanted you to get an idea of what was going on there. A couple of big industries, plus a depot for the NP, plus some other industries that the Milwaukee and the GN serve. So there was a lot of railroading in a very small area there.